If tomorrow the mountains of North Korea were to open, we wouldn't simply see roads, towns, and barracks. We would see something far more disturbing. We would see an entire country designed as a paranoid fortress. A country that doesn't just hide weapons, it buries them. It shields them. It disperses them. It protects them under rock, concrete, silence, and fear. Because North Korea was not built to live normally. It was built to endure under siege, to threaten from the shadows, and to survive even when everything around it seems to rot. And that is the most unsettling image of Kim Jong-un's regime. Not the parade, not the missile rolling between flags, not the impeccable uniform, but a state that learned to turn hunger, surveillance, and absolute obedience into a form of power. Because here is the brutal truth. North Korea is not just a poor country with weapons. It is a political machine that understood something terrifying decades ago, that a population can endure immense suffering, if at the same time, the regime convinces it that the outside world wants to destroy it, that disobedience equals death, and that sacrifice is not a tragedy, but an obligation. So when you look at North Korea, you are not just looking at a dictatorship. You are looking at a system that manages fear the way others manage money. A system that rations food, rations information, rations movement, rations truth, but never rations military ambition. And that's where the truly sinister part begins. Because while much of its population remains trapped in food insecurity, extreme surveillance, and constant repression, Pyongyang has continued expanding its nuclear and missile apparatus, with ongoing activity in Yongbyon and Gangsan. No IAEA inspectors present since 2009, and estimates of around 50 assembled warheads with enough fissile material to reach up to about 90. Think about that carefully. A regime incapable of providing normalcy to its own people, yet obsessed with perfecting the ability to destroy entire cities. A country where rice can run out, but the nuclear program does not stop. Where electricity can fail, but centrifuges keep spinning. Where the average citizen learns to stay silent, while underground, facilities, reactors, bases, logistics corridors, and launch complexes continue to expand. That is not accidental. That is doctrine, because North Korea understood it cannot compete with South Korea, Japan, or the United States in wealth, civilian technology, or quality of life. So it chose to compete in something else, its capacity to inflict pain, to threaten, to make any attempt to topple the regime unbearably costly. That is its true geopolitical business model. Not selling well-being, selling risk. Not producing prosperity, producing fear. And once you understand that, you also understand why North Korea loves the underground so much. Because beneath the surface, it doesn't just protect weapons. It protects the entire logic of the regime. Hide, disperse, survive, lounge, disappear again. North Korea's military architecture is designed for a war in which the first enemy strike cannot be the last. Its bases are not just bases. They are nodes in a hardened, distributed network, many of them never officially declared. A 2025 Tensis report described the Simpondong missile base as an undeclared installation, part of a national hardened network of around 15 to 20 ballistic bases, with large underground facilities and potential capability to operate intercontinental missiles from dispersed sites in times of crisis or war. That completely shatters the simplistic image many people have of North Korea. This is not a country that just rolls out missiles for show. This is a regime that has spent years digging strategic survival. Years, decades. While much of the world debated sanctions, statements, and summits, they were doing something colder, building the next layer of their hiding place. Because every tunnel, every gallery, every hidden base serves one central obsession: that the arsenal does not die on the runway, that the missile is not destroyed before launch, that command is not decapitated in the first hour, that the regime, even wounded, can still pull the trigger. And that makes North Korea especially dangerous, not because it is invincible. It isn't. Not because it is rich. It isn't. But because it is built to remain lethal, even when it appears suffocated. That is the core of its strategy: to endure longer than the enemy calculates, to hide more than satellites can see, and to threaten more than logic would allow for a country with that level of scarcity. But here is where the story turns even darker. Because this military machine is not sustained in a vacuum. It is sustained on bodies, on entire generations trained to obey first and never question. Human Rights Watch reported in 2025 the North Korean government tightened surveillance, information control, and market restrictions despite worsening food insecurity and inequality. It also noted that some people had to reduce food consumption while the state prioritized weapons development. Translated into real terms, that means something devastating. While part of the country counts grains, another counts warheads. While some families reduce rations, other offices calculate range, payload, and launch survival times. While a mother fears she cannot feed her child, someone in another facility is measuring metal, fuel, pressure, and performance. That coexistence of misery and militarization is one of the most disturbing aspects of the North Korean case. Because here, poverty has not stopped war. It has financed it. Scarcity has not weakened the regime. It has disciplined it. Isolation has not destroyed the system. It has hardened it. At this point, North Korea can no longer be understood merely as an ideological state. It must be understood as an extreme survival structure, one where the boundary between government, military, party, surveillance, and punishment almost disappears. Everything is connected. Propaganda does not just exist to convince. It exists to anesthetize. Surveillance does not just exist to detect traitors. And weapons do not just exist to defend against invasion. They exist to ensure the regime remains relevant even when it cannot provide a dignified life internally. That is why the missile serves a double function. Externally, it intimidates. Internally, it justifies. It justifies sacrifice. It justifies control. It justifies silence. Because if the nation is under threat, then every abuse can be sold as historical necessity. And that is exactly what North Korea has perfected. But there is another, even harsher layer. The regime no longer uses its weapons only to protect itself. It exports them as influence. And this became brutally clear in the war in Ukraine. Reuters reported in 2025 that millions of North Korean shells reached the Russian front through dozens of maritime and rail shipments. Some Russian units at times depended almost entirely on North Korean ammunition. One analysis cited by RUSI estimated that North Korea may have supplied up to 5.2 million rounds since August 2023, possibly around 40% of Russia's ammunition expenditure in that period. Other South Korean estimates placed the total above 12 million shells. Pause there, because that changes everything. For years, many saw North Korea as a contained threat, a regional problem, a loud, unpredictable dictatorship. Dangerous, yes, but limited. Then Ukraine shows something else. North Korea doesn't just store war. It exports it. It exports fire. It exports attrition. It exports industrial-scale death. This means that behind the grotesque theater of parades lies something far more serious. A real capacity to manufacture and sustain violence at scale. Not spectacular, one-day violence. Not propaganda bursts. Sustained violence. Violence measured in tons. Violence that moves in containers, crosses ports, gets unloaded, transported, and ends up exploding over trenches thousands of kilometers away. At that point, North Korea stops being just the madman with nuclear buttons. It becomes something else, an actor capable of influencing foreign wars while keeping its own population trapped inside a cage. That should send a chill down anyone's spine, because it reveals a regime that has achieved a terrifying mutation, turning its isolation into strategic utility for others. Russia doesn't just buy ammunition, it buys time, it buys volume, it buys continuity of fire. And North Korea, in return, gains something it values far more than money: geopolitical weight, military relationships, political oxygen, and proof that even a sanctioned, impoverished, brutalized state can still sell destruction in the global market of chaos. And then there is another image few want to confront directly: the North Korean soldier as a disposable extension of the regime. Human Rights Watch reported that Ukrainian forces and South Korean intelligence indicated that wounded North Korean soldiers sent to fight in Russia were sometimes executed by their own units or pushed to commit suicide rather than be captured. That is no longer just authoritarianism. That is near total ownership over the human body. Your life belongs to the state. Your hunger belongs to the state. Your silence belongs to the state. And when the time comes, even your death must be managed in a way that serves the state's narrative. That is why North Korea inspires such dread, because it does not merely repress. It absorbs the whole person and reconfigures them as a piece, a parade piece, a factory piece, an artillery piece, a border piece, a sacrificial piece. And that leads to the biggest analytical mistake many make, believing all of this is irrational. It is not. It may be monstrous, it may be cruel, it may be inhumane, but it is not irrational. It has a logic, a perverse one, yes, but a logic nonetheless. The regime calculates that as long as it can punish enough, hide enough, and threaten enough, it will survive. And so far, at an enormous human cost, it has worked. The IAEA continues to detect signs of activity at Yongbyon, including ongoing uranium enrichment, activity at Kangson, and partial operation of a light water reactor, warning that the program continues in violation of Security Council resolutions. Which means the story is not frozen. This is not an old, static danger locked in documentaries. This is a system that is still working, still adjusting, still digging, still producing, still learning, and the more it learns, the more uncomfortable it becomes for everyone else. Because an opaque regime with primitive weapons was already dangerous, but an opaque regime with a hardened base network, gradual nuclear expansion, real-world experience exporting ammunition, and an elite fully willing to sacrifice its population to preserve power, that is a different category. That is no longer geopolitical folklore. That is an adaptive threat. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: North Korea does not need to win a total war to achieve its objective. It only needs to make the cost of stopping it unbearable. It only needs to maintain the possibility of devastation large enough to force everyone else to keep calculating, containing, and negotiating around its existence. That is its strategic victory, not normality, not prosperity, not admiration, fear. Fear as a shield, fear as diplomacy. That is why every new tunnel matters, every new satellite image matters. Every sign of expansion at Yongbyon matters. Every shipment of shells to Russia matters. Because each of these pieces confirms the same truth: North Korea is not surviving by accident. It is surviving because it turned extreme militarization into the very core of its existence. And that model has an unbearable brutality. It forces millions to live worse so that a few can threaten better. It forces an entire country to function as the emotional, economic, and biological rear base of a dynastic survival project. This is not just about Kim Jong-un. It is about a structure that has learned to feed on deprivation. A structure that understood that isolation can be a wall, fanaticism can be cement, and the mountain can serve better than any treaty. So when night falls over North Korea, darkness does not tell the whole story. It has built an entire form of state around the idea that human suffering is a strategic resource, a resource to intimidate, a resource to endure, a resource to negotiate, a resource to perpetuate itself. And when a regime reaches that point, it stops being just another dictatorship. It becomes something colder, harder, much more difficult to dismantle, an architecture of fear, a buried machine, a country that learned to eat less, to aim farther, and that may be the most brutal line of all. While much of the world tried to read North Korea as an exotic anomaly, a grotesque spectacle, or a nuclear caricature, the regime did the only thing that truly mattered to it: buy time, fortify its core, deepen its network, and turn every year of survival into another layer of danger. That is why North Korea is still there, not because the system is healthy, not because it is admirable, not because it works for its people, but because it was designed for a single mission: to survive even as the country erodes, to survive even as truth is buried, to survive even as the population pays, to survive even if the price is monstrous. And when a state accepts that price, normalizes it, glorifies it, and even exports it, then you are no longer facing a simple arms dictatorship. You are facing a regime that turned hunger into discipline, the mountain into a shield, the underground into a sanctuary, and nuclear threat into its most stable way of breathing. That is the true face of North Korea. Not the one that parrots, the one that digs, the one that hides, the one that endures, the one that sacrifices, the one that stays alive because it learned to turn misery into power, silence into obedience, and fear into strategy. And as long as that continues, the most dangerous sound on Earth will not always be an explosion. Sometimes it will be something far worse, the constant, invisible subterranean hum of a machine that never stopped preparing for war.